A scarred heart, a small town, and a kindness that changes everything. Stay to uncover a story that'll hit you right in the soul. Like, subscribe, hit that bell. Stories like this give you goosebumps. Clara Hensley woke before dawn, as she had for 40 years, to the faint creak of her old wooden floorboards. The small town of Willow Creek, Tennessee, still slept under a blanket of early April mist. Her one-bedroom apartment smelled of strong coffee and faintly of lavender from a sachet tucked in her dresser. At 62, Clara's hands bore the calluses of a life spent fixing things. Benches, fences, lives. She slipped into a faded navy coat, its cuffs frayed from years of wear, and tied her grey hair into a loose bun. Her brown loafers, polished but worn, clicked softly on the linoleum as she grabbed her canvas bag, heavy with library books. The mirror by the door caught her reflection. Tired blue eyes, lines etched deep from decades of quiet struggles, and a faint scar along her jaw, a reminder of a betrayal long buried. Yet her gaze held a spark, a stubborn hope that refused to fade. Clara stepped into the chilly morning, the air sharp with damp earth and distant wood smoke. Willow Creek was a town of sagging porches and rusted pickups, where everyone knew your name but not always your story. She walked the cracked sidewalk to the town square, her routine as steady as the sunrise. The square was empty, save for a weathered wooden bench, its slat splintered from neglect. Clara set her bag down, her fingers brushing the rough wood. "Needs fixin'?" she muttered, her voice soft but firm. She'd repaired it twice before, only for kids to carve initials or storms to wear it down again. Still, she'd be back with her tools by noon. Fixing things was what Clara did, even when no one asked. Her days were filled with small acts, mending a neighbour's gate, sweeping the library steps, leaving extra change at the diner. She'd been a school janitor for 30 years, until the district restructured and let her go 5 years ago. No pension, no goodbye. Just a letter in the mail and a town that moved on. Now she lived on odd jobs and a dwindling savings account, her pride stitched into every task she took. Clara didn't talk about the past. Not the husband who left her at 30, not the son who hadn't called in a decade, not the system that chewed up her loyalty and spat her out. But she carried it all. Heavy as the toolbox she hauled everywhere. At the diner, she'd nod to Marge, the waitress, who'd slip her a free coffee. "Clara, you're too good for this place," Marge would say, her voice half teasing, half sad. Clara would just smile, her lips tight, and leave a dollar tip she couldn't afford. Kindness was her rebellion against a world that had tried to break her. This morning, as she passed the town park, she noticed a boy sitting alone on a rusty swing. He was maybe 10, his green hoodie too big, his sneakers scuffed, his dark hair poked out from a baseball cap, and he clutched a crumpled piece of paper. The swings creaked in the breeze, a lonely sound against the chirping birds. Clara slowed her step, her bag heavy on her shoulder. The boy's eyes were fixed on the ground, his small hands smudging the paper's edges. She didn't know him, new face in a town where strangers stood out. Something about his slumped shoulders tugged at her. Clara hesitated, then set her bag down by a tree. She approached, her loafers crunching on gravel. "Hey there," she called gently, keeping a distance. The boy looked up, his brown eyes wide, guarded. "You okay, kid?" He nodded quickly, too quickly, and shoved the paper into his pocket. Clara's heart ached. She knew that look, the one that hid a story too big for words. She didn't push. Instead, she pointed to the swing. "Those chains look rusty. Might need a fix soon." The boy blinked, confused, then gave a small nod. Clara smiled, her scar catching the faint morning light. "Name's Clara. I fix things around here." "Eli," he mumbled, barely audible. "Well, Eli, you ever need something fixed, you find me." She turned to leave, her coat brushing the dew-damp grass. As she reached her bag, she heard a soft, "Thanks." Clara didn't look back, but her step felt lighter. By noon, she was back in the square, her toolbox open beside the broken bench. The air smelled of pine and fresh bread from the bakery across the street. Her hands, steady despite their ache, sanded the splintered wood, the coarse sandpaper rasping rhythmically. Passers-by glanced her way. Some nodded, others hurried past. Old Mr. Thompson, in his usual flannel shirt, paused to watch. "Clara, you're wasting your time," he said, not unkindly. "That bench'll break again by winter." "Maybe," Clara replied, not looking up. "But it's good for now." Mr. Thompson shook his head and shuffled off. Clara kept sanding, her scarf loose around her neck. She didn't notice Eli watching from the park, his green hoodie blending with the trees. He'd followed her, his drawing still tucked in his pocket. His eyes, less guarded now, followed her steady hands. Clara worked through the afternoon, the sun warming her back. When the bench was smooth, she wiped her brow, her sleeve catching a bead of sweat. Eli appeared beside her, silent as a shadow. "Thirsty?" she asked, offering a small water bottle from her bag. He took it, his fingers brushing the rough canvas. "Thanks," he said again, his voice a little stronger. Clara nodded, packing her tools. "You live around here, Eli?" He pointed vaguely toward the edge of town. "With my grandma?" Clara waited, but he didn't elaborate. She didn't pry. Some stories came when they were ready. "Got a favorite book?" she asked instead, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Eli's eyes lit up, just a flicker. "Treasure Island." "Good one," Clara said, her smile warm. "Library's got a copy if you ever need it." Eli nodded, clutching the water bottle like a lifeline. As Clara walked home, the setting sun painted the square in gold. She didn't know Eli's story, but she knew the weight of being alone. That night, she left her toolbox by the door, ready for tomorrow. The town might not see her, but she'd keep fixing what she could. And maybe, just maybe, she'd fix something for Eli too. Clara Hensley's days settled into a quiet rhythm, each one stitched together with small acts of care. The town square of Willow Creek, Tennessee, hummed with April's early warmth, the air thick with the scent of blooming dogwoods and fresh coffee from the diner across the street. Clara, in her faded navy coat and grey scarf, was a familiar sight, her toolbox clanking softly as she moved from one task to another. She mended a wobbly library step, tightened a loose bolt on the park's flagpole, and swept pine needles from the church walkway. Her hands, calloused and steady, worked with a precision that spoke of decades spent making things right. Eli, the boy from the park, became a shadow at the edge of her routine. He'd appear without warning, his green hoodie and scuffed sneakers blending into the background. Clara noticed him lingering by the square's fountain one morning, his baseball cap pulled low, a crumpled drawing still tucked in his pocket. She didn't push him to talk, sensing the weight he carried in his hunched shoulders. Instead, she offered small gestures, a nod, a spare apple from her bag, a question about Treasure Island. "Read about Jim Hawkins yet?" she asked one afternoon, wiping sawdust from her hands as she fixed a splintered picnic table. Eli, sitting cross-legged on the grass, nodded. "He's brave," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the rustle of leaves. "Like you." Clara's hands paused, the sandpaper hovering over the wood. She looked at him, her blue eyes softening. "Not brave, kid, just stubborn." Eli's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She handed him a piece of sandpaper, rough and gritty in his small hands. "Want to help?" He hesitated, then took it, mimicking her slow, careful strokes. The table's surface smoothed under their shared effort, the air filled with the sharp scent of pine and the soft rasp of sandpaper. Passers-by noticed. Some smiled, others raised eyebrows. Marge, the diner waitress, leaned out the door, her apron smudged with grease. "Clara, you starting a carpentry school now?" she called, her tone teasing but warm. Clara just waved, her scarf catching the breeze. Eli kept sanding, his focus intense, as if the task held back something bigger. Clara didn't ask about his grandma or why he was always alone. She knew trust grew in silence, not questions. Each day, their moments grew. A shared water bottle, a story about pirates, a lesson on tightening bolts. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the square in amber, Eli pulled out his drawing. It was a pencil sketch of a ship, jagged and uneven but full of heart. "For you," he mumbled, shoving it toward her. Clara took it, her fingers tracing the smudged lines. "It's beautiful, Eli." He looked away, but his shoulders relaxed. She tucked the drawing into her coat pocket next to a faded photo of her son she hadn't looked at in years. The town began to notice Clara's quiet bond with the boy. At the hardware store, Mr. Jenkins, in his worn flannel vest, handed her a free pack of screws. "Seen you with that kid," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Doing good, Clara." She nodded, her lips tight, and slipped the screws into her toolbox. But not everyone approved. At the diner, Clara overheard two women in floral dresses whispering over their coffee. "She's too old to be playing nanny," one said, her voice sharp. "Kid's probably trouble. Why's he always hanging around?" Clara kept her eyes on her coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms. Marge, wiping the counter, shot the women a look, but said nothing. Clara left her usual dollar tip and walked out, the bell above the door jangling behind her. The whispers followed her to the square, where she found a poster for the town's spring fair defaced with red marker. Fix your own life, Clara. She stared at it, her hands clenching the toolbox handle. The words stung, sharp as a splinter, but she tore the poster down and kept working. Eli was there, watching from the fountain, his eyes narrowing at the crumpled paper in her hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice small. Clara forced a smile, her scar catching the fading light. "Fine, kid, just fixing things." But the town's judgment began to weigh heavier. One morning, as Clara repaired a broken fence near the church, Reverend Carter approached, his black suit crisp against the morning haze. "Clara," he said, his tone measured, "folks are talking. Say you're spending too much time with that boy." She kept hammering, the nails sinking into the soft wood. "He's a kid, Reverend. Needs someone to look out for him." "His grandma's worried," he pressed, adjusting his glasses. "Says he's skipping chores to follow you." Clara's hammer paused, her heart sinking. She hadn't known? "I'll talk to him," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache. Reverend Carter nodded and walked away, his shoes clicking on the pavement. That afternoon, Clara found Eli by the swings, his hoodie zipped tight against the chill. "Eli, your grandma's worried," she said, kneeling to his level. "You gotta help her out." His eyes dropped, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. "She's always tired," he mumbled. "Doesn't want me around." Clara's chest tightened. She knew that kind of loneliness, the kind that made you feel like a burden. "You're not a bother," she said firmly, "but you gotta show up for her. Deal?" He nodded, his cap hiding his eyes. "Deal." Clara stood, her knees creaking, and handed him a small screwdriver from her toolbox. "For your ship," she said, nodding at his pocket. "Build something strong." Eli's fingers closed around the tool, his face brightening. She walked away, the square bustling with townsfolk, their eyes lingering a little too long. The test came a week later, sharp and unexpected. Clara was fixing a leaky faucet at the community centre, her toolbox open on the tile floor. The air smelled of bleach and old carpet, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mrs. Larson, the centre's director, stormed in, her heels clicking furiously. "Clara, we've got a problem," she snapped, clutching a clipboard. "Someone's complaining about your work. Says the bench you fixed is wobbly again." Clara wiped her hands on her scarf, her brow furrowing. "I checked it yesterday, it's solid." "Well, they're saying it's not," Mrs. Larson said, her voice clipped. "And they don't like you hanging around that boy. Looks improper." Clara's hands stilled, the wrench cold against her palm. "Improper?" she repeated, her voice low. Mrs. Larson's eyes darted away. "People talk, Clara. You're not his family." The words hit like a slap, but Clara squared her shoulders. "I'm helping a kid who needs it. That's all." Mrs. Larson sighed, her clipboard tapping her thigh. "Fix the bench, and keep your distance from the boy, or we'll find someone else for these jobs." Clara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I'll check the bench." She packed her tools, the clank of metal echoing in the empty room. Outside, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. She found the bench in the square, sturdy as she'd left it. No wobble, no cracks. Someone had lied. Eli was there, his hoodie damp from the mist, his eyes wide with worry. "They're mad at you," he said, his voice trembling. "Because of me." Clara knelt, her coat brushing the wet grass. "Not your fault, Eli. People just misunderstand." He shook his head, his cap slipping. "I'll stay away." Her heart cracked, but she forced a smile. "You don't have to. Just keep helping your grandma, okay?" He nodded, but his eyes were glassy. Clara stood, her toolbox heavier than ever. The town's whispers grew louder, sharper, like thorns under her skin. At the diner, Marge slid her a coffee but avoided her eyes. "Heard about the community centre," she muttered. "Folks are saying you're stirring trouble." Clara sipped the coffee, its bitterness matching her mood. "Let 'em talk." But the talk didn't stop. By the next week, the hardware store stopped giving her discounts. Mr. Jenkins, usually gruff but kind, rang up her nails with a curt, "That's full price now." Clara paid without a word, her savings dwindling with every purchase. At church, Reverend Carter's sermon on community trust felt pointed, his glances landing on her pew. She sat alone, her scarf tight around her neck, the wooden pew creaking under her. Eli stopped coming to the square. Clara saw him once, trailing behind an older woman, his grandma, she guessed, her face lined with exhaustion. He didn't look up, his hoodie zipped to his chin. Clara kept working, but the tasks felt hollow. The fence was fixed, the flagpole steady, the library steps swept. But the town's eyes followed her, their judgment a weight she couldn't shake. One evening, as she locked her toolbox, a group of teenagers passed by, their laughter sharp. "Hey, Clara, why don't you fix your own kid?" one called, his voice dripping with mockery. The others snickered, their sneakers scuffing the pavement. Clara froze, her hand on the toolbox, the scar on her jaw burning like it was new. Her son's face flashed in her mind. His last letter, 10 years old, saying he didn't need her anymore. She walked home, the square empty, the air thick with the scent of rain. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the drawing Eli gave her spread out beside a cup of cold coffee. The ship's jagged lines blurred as her eyes stung. She'd lost her job, her family, her place in the world. Now she was losing Eli, and the town was turning her kindness into a crime. "Why do I bother?" she whispered, her voice breaking in the quiet. The lavender sachet in her dresser gave off a faint, comforting scent, but it wasn't enough. Clara folded the drawing and tucked it into her coat pocket. Tomorrow, she'd fix something else. She had to. But the conflict was far from over, and the town's cruelty was just beginning to show its teeth. The air in Willow Creek grew heavier as April bled into May, the Tennessee sun coaxing sweat from Clara Hensley's brow. Her faded navy coat hung on a hook in her small apartment, replaced by a lightweight grey cardigan, its hem frayed from years of wear. She moved through the town square with her toolbox, the clank of metal a familiar rhythm. But each step felt like wading through mud. The whispers had turned to stares, the stares to words, sharp and deliberate, cutting deeper than Clara let on. She fixed a loose shutter on the library, the wood's grainy texture rough under her calloused fingers. The air smelled of warm asphalt and blooming honeysuckle, but the sweetness couldn't mask the bitterness settling in her chest. Eli hadn't been to the square in days, his absence a quiet ache Clara hadn't expected. She'd see him sometimes, trailing his grandma at the grocery store, his green hoodie zipped tight, his eyes fixed on the ground. Clara kept working, mending a gate, patching a cracked birdhouse, but the tasks felt like shouting into a void. The town's judgment had hardened, a wall she couldn't fix with her tools. One morning, as she tightened a bolt on the park's flagpole, a group of women passed by, their floral dresses bright against the grey pavement. "She's still at it," one muttered, loud enough to carry. "Wasting time on things nobody cares about." Clara's wrench slipped, scraping her knuckle. She wiped the blood on her cardigan, her jaw tight, and kept turning the bolt. The women's laughter lingered, sharp as broken glass. At the diner, Marge slid her a coffee but didn't meet her eyes. "Folks are talking, Clara," she whispered, wiping the counter with a rag. "Saying you're causing trouble with that boy." Clara's fingers tightened around the mug, the ceramic hot against her palm. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice low. Marge shrugged, her apron smudged with grease. "Just repeating what I hear." Clara left her dollar tip, the bell above the door jangling as she stepped into the humid morning. The square was bustling, but the faces around her felt like strangers. She found a new poster on the community center's bulletin board, its edges curling in the heat. "Clara Hensley, mind your own business." Red marker slashed across her name, the ink bleeding into the paper. Her hands shook as she tore it down, the paper crumpling in her fist. She stuffed it into her toolbox, her scar burning along her jaw. That afternoon, Clara sat on the bench she'd repaired, the wood smooth under her fingers. The square was quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain. She pulled Eli's drawing from her pocket, the ship's jagged lines smudged but clear. Her eyes stung, not from the heat, but from the weight of it all. "Why do I keep trying?" she whispered, her voice cracking in the stillness. The question hung unanswered, heavy as the clouds rolling in. The emotional peak came on a Sunday, grey and oppressive, the air heavy with unshed rain. Clara was fixing a broken step at the church, her hammer's steady rhythm echoing in the empty lot. Reverend Carter approached, his black suit stark against the overcast sky. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. She kept hammering, the nail sinking into the soft wood. "About what?" "Eli's grandma came to me," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She's upset. Says you've been filling his head with ideas, keeping him from his chores." Clara's hammer froze, her heart pounding. "I told him to help her," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I ain't doing nothing wrong." Reverend Carter sighed, his shoes scuffing the gravel. "People are uncomfortable, Clara. They see you with him, and they assume things." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp and unyielding. "Assume what? That I'm helping a kid who's got no one else?" His gaze faltered, dropping to the ground. "It's not just that. There's talk about your past, your son." The words hit like a fist, stealing her breath. Her son, gone 10 years, his last letter a cold dismissal of her love. Clara's hands clenched, the hammer's handle digging into her palm. "My son's got nothing to do with this," she said, her voice low, dangerous. Reverend Carter raised a hand, placating. "I'm just saying what's been said, for your own good." Clara turned back to the step, her hammer striking harder than necessary. "Tell them to mind their own," she said, each word a nail driven deep. He walked away, his silhouette fading into the grey. Clara finished the step, her hands shaking, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She packed her tools, the toolbox heavier than ever, and headed home. The rain began to fall, cold and relentless, soaking her cardigan. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the lavender sachet's faint scent, no comfort. Eli's drawing lay beside a cold cup of coffee, the ship's lines mocking her. She'd given everything, her time, her pride, her heart, and it wasn't enough. The town didn't want her kindness. It wanted her gone. Her fingers traced the scar on her jaw, a relic of a night 30 years ago when her husband's anger had left more than bruises. She'd survived him, survived losing her son, survived the system that discarded her. But this betrayal by a town she'd served, felt like a wound too deep to heal. "I'm done," she whispered, her voice breaking in the dark. She folded the drawing and tucked it into a drawer, her hands trembling. The next morning, Clara didn't go to the square. She stayed home, her toolbox untouched by the door. The rain continued, a steady drum against her windows. She tried to read, to clean, to do anything but think, but the silence was deafening. Eli's absence was a hole she couldn't fill. She wondered where he was, if he was okay, but the town's warnings kept her rooted. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Clara ventured out only for groceries, her cardigan damp from the endless drizzle. At the store, she saw Eli's grandma, her face lined with exhaustion, her cart filled with canned soup and cheap bread. Clara nodded, but the woman looked away, her lips tight. Clara paid for her milk and bread, her hands shaking as she counted change. The cashier, a young man with a bored expression, muttered, "Heard you're causing trouble?" Clara didn't respond, her scar burning under the fluorescent lights. The public condemnation grew louder, more brazen. At the diner, a group of men in flannel shirts laughed as she passed. "Hey, Clara, why don't you fix your own mess?" one called, his voice thick with mockery. The others joined in, their laughter a blade twisting in her gut. Marge didn't look up, her rag moving faster across the counter. Clara kept walking, her loafers splashing through puddles, her heart pounding. Posters appeared around town, each one worse than the last. "Clara Hensley, leave our kids alone." Some were signed with initials, others anonymous, but they all carried the same venom. Clara tore them down when she could, her hands raw from ripping paper, but they kept reappearing. One evening, she found a note slipped under her door. "You're not wanted here." The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar, but it cut just the same. Clara stood in her apartment. The note crumpled in her fist, her breath ragged. She'd faced cruelty before, but this was different. This was a town turning its back on her. She sank into a chair, her eyes falling on the drawer where Eli's drawing lay. The weight of it all, her son's rejection, her husband's betrayal, the system's indifference, crashed over her like a wave. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, the tears she'd held back for years spilling free. "I tried," she sobbed, her voice muffled against her palms. "I tried!" The words echoed in the empty room, unanswered. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Clara's hands stilled, her breathing slowing. She stood, her legs unsteady, and opened the drawer. Eli's drawing was there, its jagged ship a beacon in the dark. She unfolded it, her fingers tracing the lines. Beside it was the faded photo of her son, his smile frozen at 16, before the world pulled him away. Clara held both, her scar catching the dim light of a single bulb. She remembered a promise she'd made long ago after her husband left, after the hospital stitched her jaw. To keep going, to keep fixing, no matter what. It was a promise to herself, not the town, not her son, not even Eli. She tucked the drawing and photo into her cardigan pocket, her hand steadier now. The town could condemn her, could tear her down, but they couldn't take her resolve. Clara didn't know what came next, but she knew she wasn't done. Not yet. She opened her toolbox, the metal cool under her fingers, and pulled out a screwdriver. Tomorrow, she'd fix something, maybe a fence, maybe a heart. The rain still fell. But Clara's eyes were clear, her scar a map of survival, not shame. She wasn't broken, not yet, and Willow Creek would have to try harder to make her stop. The rain in Willow Creek slowed to a drizzle by mid-May, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and blooming lilacs. Clara Hensley moved through the town square, her grey cardigan damp at the shoulders, her toolbox a steady weight in her hand. Her brown loafers splashed through shallow puddles, each step deliberate, as if reclaiming ground the town had tried to take. The posters condemning her had faded, their ink smeared by the weather, but the sting of their words lingered. She fixed a wobbly table at the library, the wood smooth grain cool under her fingers, and tightened a hinge on the diner's back door. Her scar, etched along her jaw, caught the soft morning light, a quiet testament to battles fought and survived. Clara didn't speak of the town's cruelty, didn't dwell on Eli's absence, but her hands worked with a fierce determination. Each task a defiance of the voices that had tried to silence her. The revelation came on a quiet Thursday, the sky a pale blue after days of grey. Clara was repairing a cracked bird feeder in the park, the faint chirp of sparrows mixing with the creak of her screwdriver. She hadn't seen Eli in weeks, his green hoodie a memory that tugged at her heart. As she tightened the last screw, a woman approached, her steps hesitant on the gravel path. She was older, her hair a wiry grey, her face lined with exhaustion. Eli's grandma, Clara realized, her breath catching. The woman clutched a manila envelope, its edges worn, and stopped a few feet away. "Clara," she said, her voice rough but steady, "I owe you an apology." Clara set down her screwdriver, her hands still, her blue eyes wary. "For what?" The woman, Mrs. Dorsey, she introduced herself, shifted, her fingers tightening on the envelope. "For listening to the gossip? For keeping Eli away." She paused, her lips trembling. "You were good to him? Better than I've been?" Clara's throat tightened, but she stayed silent, letting the woman speak. Mrs. Dorsey's eyes dropped to the ground. "Eli's mama, my daughter, passed 2 years ago. His daddy's been gone longer. I'm all he's got, but I ain't enough. Too tired, too broke." She looked up, her gaze meeting Clara's. "He talked about you, said you fixed things, said you listened." Clara's hands clenched, the toolbox handle digging into her palm. "He's a good kid," she said softly. Mrs. Dorsey nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "He drew this for you." She handed Clara the envelope, her hands shaking. "And there's something else, from me." Clara took it, the paper crinkling under her fingers. Inside was a new drawing, another ship, this one steadier, its sails bold with coloured pencils. Below it, in Eli's careful scrawl, were the words, "For Clara, who fixes everything." Tucked behind it was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, its edges creased. Mrs. Dorsey's voice broke the silence. "Read it later, please." Clara nodded, slipping the envelope into her cardigan pocket next to Eli's first drawing and the faded photo of her son. Mrs. Dorsey turned to leave, then paused. "He's at the library today, if you want to see him." Clara's heart lifted, but she only said, "Thank you." As Mrs. Dorsey walked away, the park seemed quieter, the air softer, as if the world had exhaled. Clara finished the bird feeder, her hands steadier now, and headed to the library. The catharsis unfolded in the library's quiet reading room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows, dusting the air with gold. Eli sat at a table, his green hoodie unzipped, a copy of Treasure Island open before him. His baseball cap rested on the chair, his dark hair messy. Clara approached, her loafers silent on the carpet, her toolbox left by the door. "Eli," she said softly. He looked up, his brown eyes wide, then bright with relief. "Clara!" He stood, hesitating, then hugged her, his small arms fierce around her waist. Clara froze, then rested a hand on his shoulder, her scar catching the light. "Missed you, kid," she said, her voice thick. Eli pulled back, his smile shy but real. "Grandma said I could come back. Said you're okay." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Glad to hear it." They sat, the book between them, and talked about pirates, ships, the square. Eli's words tumbled out, his loneliness spilling free, but so did his hope. Clara listened, her hands folded, her heart full. When he paused, she pulled out his new drawing, her fingers tracing the sails. "This is beautiful," she said. Eli's cheeks flushed. "It's stronger now, like you." Clara's eyes stung, but she smiled, tucking the drawing back into her pocket. That evening, alone in her apartment, she read Mrs. Dorsey's letter. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, its words raw and unpolished. Clara, I judged you without knowing you. I was wrong. Eli's been happier since you came along. You gave him something I couldn't hope. I told the town council what you've done for him. They're listening. I'm sorry for the pain we caused. You're a good woman. Clara folded the letter, her hands trembling, and pressed it against Eli's drawing. The tears came then. Not from pain, but from a release she hadn't known she needed. The town's cruelty had wounded her. But this small act of recognition, felt like a stitch in a long-torn seam. The community began to shift slowly, like a river, finding a new path. The next morning, Clara found a note taped to the repaired bench in the square. Thank you, Clara. No name, just a simple scrawl, but it was enough. At the diner, Marge slid her a coffee and a slice of pie, her eyes soft. On the house, she said. Folks are talking different now. Clara nodded, her dollar tip left anyway. Mr. Jenkins at the hardware store slipped her a free pack of nails, his gruff voice low. Didn't know about the kid, he said. You're all right, Clara. The posters stopped appearing, replaced by a new sign on the community centre's bulletin board. Volunteers needed. Join Clara's fix-up crew. Mrs. Larson, the director, approached Clara at the park, her clipboard nowhere in sight. We're starting a program, she said, her voice hesitant. Fixing things around town. Thought you could lead it. Clara's hand stilled on the bird feeder, her scar catching the sunlight. I'll think about it, she said, but her eyes held a spark. Reverend Carter preached a sermon on forgiveness the next Sunday, his gaze lingering on Clara's pew. She sat with Eli and Mrs. Dorsey, their presence a quiet anchor. The congregation didn't applaud, but their nods were a start. The men who'd mocked her at the diner fell silent when she passed, their eyes dropping to their plates. One, the loudest, muttered an apology, his voice barely audible. Clara didn't respond, but her step was lighter. The legacy of Clara's kindness took root in small ways, blooming like the lilacs that lined the square. Eli joined her in the park, his screwdriver in hand, helping fix a wobbly swing. Mrs. Dorsey brought them lemonade, her tired face softened by a smile. Kids from the library started tagging along, their laughter filling the square as Clara taught them to sand wood and tighten bolts. The fix-up crew grew, a mix of young and old, their hands learning what Clara had always known. Fixing things fixed you too. The town council funded a small workshop in the community centre, its shelves stocked with tools Clara had once bought with her own dwindling savings. Eli's drawings hung on the walls, ships sailing alongside photos of repaired benches and fences. Clara didn't speak of her past. Not her son, not her husband, not the system that had discarded her. But she wore her scar with pride, a badge of survival, not shame. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the square in gold, Clara sat on the bench she'd fixed months ago. Eli sat beside her, his green hoodie bright against the wood, his baseball cap in his lap. Clara, he said, his voice steady, you're like Jim Hawkins, brave. She smiled, her hand resting on his drawing in her pocket. Nah, kid, I'm just stubborn. He grinned, and for a moment, the square was theirs. Clara's apartment felt warmer now, the lavender sachet's scent mingling with the smell of fresh coffee. Her toolbox sat by the door, ready for tomorrow. She'd lost much, her son, her job, her place in the world. But she'd gained something too. A purpose, a family, a town that was learning to see her. Her kindness, once a quiet rebellion, had become a legacy, etched into every repaired bench, every child's smile, every nod from a neighbour. The final image lingered in the square at dusk, Clara and Eli walking side by side. Her grey cardigan catching the breeze, his green hoodie glowing in the fading light. Her toolbox swung gently, its clank a soft heartbeat. The bench stood strong behind them, its wood smooth, a testament to hands that never gave up. The air smelled of lilacs and possibility. The town quiet but alive, its heart beating a little kinder. Clara's scar caught the last rays of sun, a map of courage, a story of survival. She didn't look back, but her step was sure, her eyes fixed on the horizon. What moved you most about Clara's story? Drop it in the comments, hit that like, subscribe, and ring the bell. These stories remind us what heroism really looks diversion.